The dry wind of the late afternoon swept dust across the main street of the small frontier town, carrying with it the smells of horse sweat, gun oil, and whiskey. Wooden signs creaked above the storefronts, and somewhere a church bell tolled faintly, announcing the end of another day in the rugged land. Folks in the town were used to hardship, used to danger. But what was about to unfold in the heart of that settlement was something none of them would ever forget. It began in the saloon, the place where deals were struck, fortunes lost, tempers boiled hotter than the prairie sun. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the clink of glasses. Men in dust-stained hats leaned over worn tables, voices low, laughter rough, every face hiding stories carved by the frontier life. The swinging doors groaned open every few minutes, letting in another drifter, another ranch hand, another soul hoping to lose or win something before the night ended. Among that crowd, she was out of place. A woman with hair like fire and eyes that carried both defiance and fear. She sat at the edge of the room, her hands twisting at her skirt as though she was holding herself together in a place that meant her no good. She hadn't come to the saloon for whiskey or cards, and she certainly hadn't come to smile at the rough men who crowded the bar. She was there because she had no choice. Circumstances had pushed her into the lion's den. Though she tried to hide the tremble in her voice when spoken to, she knew every glance toward her was one of danger. Men who had drunk too much, who had fought too long, were not gentle in their looks. Still, she sat, waiting. As if for someone or something she dared not name aloud, the sound of boots striking the floor grew louder as a group of men approached her table. Their laughter stopped when they drew close, and the tone of the room shifted ever so slightly.
Almost.
Patrons pretended not to notice. One man, broad-shouldered with a face like weathered stone, leaned in too close, his breath heavy with whiskey. "Don't look so scared," he muttered, voice low but sharp enough to cut through her composure. "No one's here to hurt you unless you make it hard on yourself." His words carried the weight of a threat, one that brought the color from her face but lit something in her eyes, something that refused to break. The saloon doors swung again, and the last light of the evening framed a tall figure who stepped inside. His presence was a storm in the room. Dark hair tied back, shoulders squared, and eyes scanning the crowd with the watchfulness of someone who had learned to trust no one. He was not like the others. His skin bore the hue of the desert sun, his movements carrying the silent strength of a man born to a world outside the wooden walls of this settlement. Whispers traveled quickly. An Apache, a warrior, here in a town that had never looked kindly on his people. Every head turned, some in hostility, some in fear, and some in curiosity. He ignored them all, his gaze locked onto the woman sitting stiffly, surrounded by danger. And in that moment the room seemed to shrink. The man who had been leaning over her turned, squaring his shoulders against the newcomer. "You're far from your lands," he sneered, though his voice lacked the confidence he wanted it to carry. "This ain't your place." But the Apache's eyes never left the woman. In her, he saw more than fear. He saw a struggle against chains that could not be seen, but were heavy all the same. He had heard whispers, too, of what these men planned for her, and he would not stand by. The room thickened with tension, as if the air itself held its breath. Cards lay forgotten, glasses stilled, and the only sound was the steady creak of the floorboards as the Apache stepped forward. His hands were empty, but there was nothing uncertain in the way he moved. The men around her stiffened, one resting his hand near the pistol on his hip, another grinning with the bravado of someone who had never faced real danger. The woman's chest rose and fell quickly, her eyes darting between them all, and she realized without knowing why that her fate was about to change. What followed seemed to happen in the span of a heartbeat. The Apache's hand shot out, pulling the woman to her feet, his other arm circling her as though she weighed nothing. Shouts rang out, chairs scraped, and fists clenched, but he moved with the swiftness of a man who had lived his whole life fighting the odds. She gasped, not in fear of him, but at the suddenness of it all, at the way the world spun around her while he held her steady. The men cursed and drew steel, but their hesitation was their weakness. He pushed through, his eyes locked on the doorway as though it were the only point of light in a room of darkness. The woman clutched at his arm, her voice breaking into a whisper. "They'll kill you," but he only tightened his hold, his steps sure and strong. Around them, the saloon erupted into chaos. Men shouted, others lunged forward, but none moved fast enough to stop him. Bullets had not yet flown, but every finger itched on the trigger. Every eye burned with fury that an outsider would dare walk into their den and take what they thought belonged to them. The sound of boots pounded closer, but his stride never faltered. Outside, out. The night had fallen. Stars scattered above the wide prairie sky. The street, once quiet, now trembled with the echoes of pursuit. He carried her as though her fear was his burden and her life his mission, his breath steady against the rising storm. Behind them, angry voices spilled from the saloon, and more figures poured into the dusty street. The danger was not gone, it had only begun. She turned her face up, toward him, the firelight of the saloon flickering against her hair. For the first time, she met his eyes, and in them she saw no fear, only determination carved deep as the desert canyons. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking with disbelief. But before he could answer, the sound of guns being cocked filled the street, and the night became a taut string waiting to snap. The small town held its breath once more, for the next heartbeat would decide everything. The sound of boots striking against the dirt road grew louder. As more men spilled out of the saloon, their shouts carrying into the night. Lanterns swung in the doorways, spilling yellow light into the street, and rifles appeared from behind windows. The Apache kept moving, his grip on her firm, his eyes scanning the shadows with the precision of someone who had been hunted before. She clung to him in silence, her heart racing, her mind struggling to catch up with the storm that had taken hold of her life. Just hours earlier, she had thought she might escape the saloon quietly, unnoticed. But nothing about this night was ordinary anymore. The town itself seemed alive in that moment. Dogs barked from somewhere behind a fence. A horse whinnied and kicked at its stall, and the whisper of the prairie wind carried the smell of rain, all of it mixed with the shouts of the men behind them. The woman couldn't understand why this stranger, this warrior from a people feared and hated by many in town, had chosen to risk everything for her. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but there was no denying the way he had looked at her in the saloon. Not as prey, not as a prize, but as someone worth saving. As they reached the edge of the wooden boardwalk, he paused, lowering her to the ground, but keeping a protective arm around her. He leaned close, his voice low, steady, and commanding. "Stay close. Do not fall." The words were simple, but there was something in his tone that told her he meant them with his whole being. She nodded, though her legs felt weak, as if they might give out at any moment. He pulled her into the shadows between two buildings, just as gunfire cracked behind them. Splinters flew from the wooden wall near her head, and she flinched, but he held her steady and moved swiftly. Guiding her deeper into the darkness, the men from the saloon cursed, their boots scattering across the street, searching in every direction. "Find them," one shouted, his voice sharp with rage. Another swore he'd seen them slip toward the livery, and the pack of pursuers broke apart, spreading like wolves in the night. The Apache waited in silence, his breath calm, his hand pressed against her shoulder, as if anchoring her. She realized in that stillness how differently he carried himself compared to the others. He was not frantic, not clumsy, but quiet and measured, as though the chase was a language he had spoken all his life. For a moment, she let herself look at him fully, his face lit faintly by the glow of the lanterns outside the alley. His eyes were dark and steady, his jaw strong, his expression unreadable but unyielding. She wondered where he had come from, what had brought him into the saloon at that exact moment. And she wondered what it would cost him to stand against men who had never once shown mercy to outsiders. Before she could ask, he moved again, leading her through a back path that wound behind the stable. The smell of hay and horses mixed with the dust, and the sound of hooves shifting restlessly, told her that their pursuers had not been the only ones stirred by the one. Commotion, the woman's mind drifted back, despite herself, to the events that had trapped her in the saloon. She had grown up far from this town, in a place where the grass stretched green and wide, where her father had once worked the land with hope in his heart. But hope had dried up with the soil, and after sickness, swept through her family. She had been left alone, forced to move west in search of work. The promise of opportunity had been nothing more than a cruel joke. Every door she knocked on had been closed. Every town had reminded her of what she lacked: money, protection, a name that carried weight. By the time she had arrived here, her choices had been thin as the soup she ate, and the saloon had been the only place that would take her in, though she had quickly learned it was a place where women were not treated as equals, nor even as people with dignity. She had been a cornered animal, waiting for the day the cage closed fully around her, and tonight it nearly had. Now, with the Apache at her side, she felt a strange clash of fear and relief. Fear of the men who hunted them. Fear of what they might do if they caught her. Relief that someone, anyone, had dared to stand in the way. But the relief was fleeting, for she knew that what he had done would bring him into the full wrath of the town. Outsiders were not welcome here, especially not ones like him, and helping her would not be forgiven. As they crept behind the livery, she whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Her voice trembled, the words nearly lost in the sound of men calling to one another. He did not answer at first, his eyes fixed on the street, reading the shadows, listening to every step as if the night itself spoke to him. Finally, in a quiet tone, he said, "Because you are not safe, and I will not let them take you." It was not the answer she expected, and yet it was more than enough. He had spoken with no hesitation, no doubt. It was a vow, and it sent a shiver down her spine. The sound of a rifle being cocked nearby jolted them both. He pressed her against the wall, his body shielding hers, and they watched as two men passed close, their lanterns swinging wide, nearly catching them in its light. The woman held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give them away. But the Apache remained still, unshaken, until the men passed. Then he moved again, quick and silent, leading her out of the alley and toward the open fields beyond the town's edge. She stumbled in her long skirt, the uneven ground catching at her shoes. But he steadied her every time. The chase was far from over. Behind them, the men shouted, realizing their quarry had slipped away again. Horses were being saddled, and soon the night would echo with hooves pounding against the hard earth. The Apache glanced back once, then guided her faster, his steps purposeful. She could feel the storm building all around them, and though she did not know where he intended to take her, she knew she had no choice but to follow, as they crossed beyond the last row of houses. The town seemed to fall away, swallowed by the vastness of the land. The prairie stretched out before them, a sea of grass under the moonlight, the horizon endless and dark. The woman felt small against it all, but the Apache moved as though it was his ally, each step sure, each direction chosen with care. He seemed to know the land in a way no one else could, as though every shadow and every breeze told him where safety might be found. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Would they ever be safe? The men hunting them were ruthless, and the town itself would not forgive what had happened. Whispers would spread by morning. Stories would grow wild about the Apache who stormed into the saloon and carried a woman out in front of everyone. They would call him a thief, a savage, a threat. And her? They would call her worse. She felt the weight of that truth press heavy against her chest. Yet when she glanced at him, she found strength in the way he carried himself, unyielding, determined, as though he had carried heavier burdens before and had never once set them down. The prairie wind grew stronger, pushing against them, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The storm was coming, and with it, perhaps, cover from the men who hunted them. Or perhaps more danger. She didn't know. All she knew was that the night would not end peacefully. Somewhere behind them, the sound of horses rose, and with it, the certainty that their pursuers would not stop until blood was drawn. The Apache slowed. Listening, his hand lifting slightly to signal her to stay still, she obeyed, her breath caught in her throat. His gaze swept the darkness, his eyes narrowing, and she realized he was calculating, choosing not just how to escape, but how to fight if the fight came to them. She wondered how many times he had done this before, how many battles he had survived, how many enemies he had faced alone. And she wondered, too, what it meant that she was now a part of his struggle. The first drops of rain began to fall, pattering softly against the dry earth, and the night seemed to hold its breath once more. The woman looked at him, fear and gratitude mixing in her chest, and whispered the only words she could find. "What will happen to us now?" But before he could answer, the thunder rolled louder, and the distant crack of gunfire carried across the prairie. The chase was far from over. The night was only beginning. The gunfire echoed faintly across the prairie, carried on the wind until it blended with the distant thunder. The woman's breath came quick and shallow, her body trembling from exhaustion. But the Apache guided her with the same calm strength he had shown since pulling her from the saloon. His pace was steady, his eyes sharp, as though every rustle of grass and every whisper of the wind carried meaning. She followed because there was no other choice, but also because, deep down, something in her trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in a long time. Behind them, the riders gave chase. The pounding of hooves struck against the earth, growing louder, a reminder that their enemies were not far. These were men hardened by the frontier, men who had never let go of grudges, men who would not stop until blood answered the insult they believed had been dealt inside the saloon. They did not see her as a victim, they saw her as property, as a prize taken out from under their watch. And him, the outsider, they saw as a threat that needed to be crushed before dawn. The storm began to break, lightning flashing across the sky, followed by the deep growl of thunder. Rain poured down in sudden sheets, soaking her dress and plastering her red hair against her face. She stumbled, but his hand caught hers firmly, pulling her onward. The rain would slow their pursuers, but it also made the ground slick, the paths uncertain. Still, he pressed on, leading her toward the black silhouette of the hills that rose against the horizon. As they climbed higher, her thoughts scattered between fear and memory. She remembered the way the saloon had swallowed her whole when she first stepped inside. A place where survival meant silence, and where every smile offered came with a price. She had watched too many other women fall into despair there, their hopes drowned in cheap whiskey and false promises. She had promised herself she would not end like them. Promises meant little when men with power had no intention of letting her go. That night had been the moment she dreaded most, the moment when their patience ended and their intentions turned to action. If not for the Apache's arrival, she knew her life would have taken a dark, irreversible turn. The hills gave them cover, the rocks and brush breaking the open line of sight. He paused, finally allowing her to rest against a boulder while he scanned the land below. Rain trickled down his face, his jaw set in concentration. She watched him, noticing again how his movements seemed purposeful, shaped by years of struggle. He didn't waste energy, didn't speak without reason. Everything he did seemed to come from a deep knowledge of the world that she could barely comprehend. The riders spread out below, their lanterns like fireflies in the storm. Shouts carried faintly upward, curses cutting through the rain. They were searching every bend, every hollow, and it was only a matter of time before they began to climb. The woman's chest tightened. "They'll find us," she whispered. He glanced at her, his expression calm but firm. "Let them try," he replied. She didn't know what gave him such confidence, but there was something in the way he said it that steadied her trembling hands. Yet even as she found herself clinging to his strength, a new fear grew inside her. What if he was caught? What if he paid the price for saving her? She couldn't bear the thought of it, and yet she knew he had stepped into this willingly, knowing the risk. Farther into the hills they found shelter in a shallow cave, its stone walls slick with rain. He led her inside, brushing away branches at the entrance to conceal their presence. She collapsed against the wall, her dress heavy with water, her breath ragged. He crouched near the entrance, listening, his body poised like a bowstring, ready to release. The storm masked their pursuers for now, but the woman knew the men were relentless. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cold seeping into her bones, and dared to ask again what had been burning in her mind since he pulled her from that saloon. "Why me? You don't even know who I am." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a quiet tone, he answered, "I know what it is to be hunted. I know what it is to have no voice, to have others decide your fate. He turned his gaze toward her, and in the flicker of lightning outside, she saw the truth in his eyes. I would not leave you there. His words struck deep, stirring something in her she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was the simple realization that someone had seen her not as a burden, not as a possession, but as a person worth saving. She swallowed hard, unable to speak. But her silence said enough. Yet even as a fragile bond grew between them, the conflict outside deepened. The town would not forget what had happened. The saloon men would not stop their hunt, and whispers of an Apache warrior storming into their place and defying them would spread like wildfire, stirring hatred, fanning old grudges between settlers and tribes. What had begun as one night's escape was quickly becoming something larger, something that would not end easily. The woman thought of the lives that had shaped this town, the farmers, the cattlemen, the drifters, who came through seeking gold or land. All of them had built their survival on fear and control. The Apache's presence threatened that control, threatened the fragile line of power they held. And she, by being with him, was now caught in the middle of a fight she'd never asked for. Elsewhere. In the saloon, the aftermath of the escape brewed into violence of its own. The men argued among themselves, their pride wounded, their tempers flaring. Some demanded blood immediately, while others spoke of waiting until the sheriff could rally more men. Old grudges against the Apache's people surfaced, mixed with the greed of those who saw the woman as a possession that had been stolen. And in the shadows of the room, voices whispered of larger trouble, that the tribes in the hills might not take kindly to one of their own being hunted so openly. The conflict was no longer just about a woman being taken from the saloon. It was about pride, power, and the clash of two worlds that had long been at odds. The Apache and the woman were no longer just fugitives. They were symbols of defiance, of rebellion against the order the town believed it had established. As the night wore on, the rain softened to a drizzle, but the weight of what lay ahead only grew heavier. The Apache sat at the cave's entrance, listening, watching, while she lay wrapped in her damp skirt, unable to sleep. Every crack of thunder, every echo of hoofbeats in the distance, kept her wide-eyed. Yet despite the fear, she found herself staring at him, wondering about the life that had shaped him. What battles had he fought before tonight? What family, if any, waited for him? And why had fate placed them both on this collision course in the heart of such a merciless land? The storm passed, leaving the night heavy with mist. Somewhere below, the riders regrouped, their shouts muffled but persistent. The chase would resume at dawn, and she knew the hills would offer only so much protection. She wanted to ask what his plan was, how they could possibly escape men who would stop at nothing, but she held her tongue. For now, silence felt like the only shield they had. The prairie stretched endless beyond the hills, but so did the dangers. The conflict was far larger than their flight through the storm. It was the clash of worlds, of laws written by settlers against the traditions of a people who had lived on the land long before. And she, caught between them, could feel the tension pulling tighter, as though the night itself was preparing to snap. The Apache turned at last, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. His voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of truth. They will not stop. And neither will I. The words settled over her like both a promise and a warning. She knew then that their journey had only begun, and that the real danger was yet to come. The conflict that stretched far beyond them was closing in, and the choices they would make in the days ahead would decide not just their fate, but perhaps the fate of everyone caught in the storm between the town and the tribes. And as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, the sound of hooves once more shook the earth. The hunt had found them again. The pale light of dawn broke over the hills, washing the land in shades of gray. The woman sat against the rough wall of the cave, her dress clinging damply to her skin, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but too alert to close. Outside, the mist curled through the valleys, veiling the land like a secret. Yet within that mist, the sound of hooves echoed again, steady and deliberate. The hunters had not given up. They had waded through the storm, regrouped, and now, with the coming of morning, they had renewed their chase. The Apache crouched near the cave's mouth, his gaze fixed on the shifting fog. He did not move, yet his presence filled the space with calm strength. The woman studied him quietly, marveling at how still he could remain even as danger pressed so close. Her own nerves felt like frayed wire ready to snap, but he seemed made for moments like this. Every line of his body spoke of discipline, of battles endured, of survival carved from the unforgiving land. From below, voices rose angry, determined, each one belonging to a man who wanted blood. They had been humiliated in the saloon, their pride wounded by the Apache's bold defiance. To them, the chase was no longer about one woman. It was about proving dominance, about punishing an outsider who had dared to walk into their den and leave unbroken. Pride, greed, and hatred made their pursuit relentless. The Apache motioned for her to stay quiet, then slipped from the cave's shadow, moving with the silence of a wolf. She wanted to call out, to beg him not to leave her alone, but her voice caught in her throat. She watched him disappear into the mist, her heart pounding harder than the hooves below. Every moment stretched unbearably. The world outside was nothing but shifting gray and the distant echo of men drawing closer. When he returned, his movements were swift, his eyes sharp. "They are circling," he said in a low voice. "We cannot stay here." His words sent a chill through her. The cave, though damp and cold, had felt like their only protection. Now even that thin comfort was gone. They descended deeper into the hills, slipping between boulders and brush, the mist cloaking their steps. The woman's body ached, her legs heavy, but she pressed on, guided by his steady hand. The land seemed endless, stretching in every direction, yet the shouts of their pursuers grew nearer. The hunters were closing in, and the hills could not hold them forever as they moved. She thought of the town they had left behind. She imagined the saloon men rallying others, stirring hatred with every retelling of the night before. The Apache would be painted as a savage beast, she as a willing accomplice or worse. Lies would spread faster than truth, and soon the whole territory might be against them. She shivered at the thought. Realizing how much larger their danger had grown in a single night, they reached a ridge, the land falling sharply away into a valley below. The woman gasped at the sight. Through the mist, she could see another camp tents, fires smoldering low, figures moving in the distance. Her heart clenched. "More of them?" she whispered, but the Apache shook his head. "Not them. My people." Relief flooded her for an instant, but just as quickly came unease. She had heard the town's stories, the cruel tales told of raids, of violence. She knew those stories were shaped by fear and prejudice, yet she could not banish them from her mind. What would his people think of her? A stranger, burden. Would they see her as someone worth protecting, or would they turn her away, leaving her to the mercy of the men who hunted her? Before she could speak, the sound of rifles cracked behind them, bullets striking the ridge. The Apache pulled her down, shielding her with his body as dirt sprayed into the air. The men had found them. Voices shouted, boots clattered against rock, and the hunters pressed up the ridge with fury in their steps. The Apache's eyes flashed with resolve. He pulled her to her feet and urged her down the far side, toward the valley. "Go," he commanded, his tone sharp with urgency. She stumbled forward, her heart hammering, while the echo of gunfire tore the morning apart. Every step was a battle. The ground was slick with rain, her skirts catching on brush and stone. More than once she fell, but each time his hand caught her, pulling her onward. Behind them, the hunters surged closer, their shouts carrying like thunder. The valley loomed below, the camp of his people waiting, though whether it meant safety or another kind of danger, she could not know. As they neared the bottom of the ridge, figures rose from the mist. Warriors stood with bows drawn, their faces painted, their eyes watchful. The woman froze, her breath caught in her chest. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. The world balanced on the edge of a blade. Between the hunters closing from above and the warriors waiting below, they were caught in a no-man's land. The Apache raised his hand, calling out in words she could not understand, his voice steady, commanding, filled with authority. The warriors did not lower their bows, but neither did they loose their arrows. The air was taut, filled with the tension of choices not yet made. The woman's fear deepened. Would these people see her as someone worth saving, or as a problem delivered to their doorstep? She could not read their eyes, could not hear their whispers. All she knew was that the sound of hooves and rifles grew nearer with every breath. The Apache turned to her, his expression fierce but calm. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. She obeyed, though her knees shook beneath her above them. The hunters crested the ridge, their rifles glinting in the morning light. They shouted at the sight below, their fury redoubled at realizing where the chase had led. The woman's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. The hunters raised their rifles, the warriors tightened their grips on their bows, and the Apache stood between both sides, unflinching, unyielding. The clash was inevitable, and she knew the next heartbeat would ignite it. The world seemed to hold still, suspended in a silence sharper than any blade. The woman could feel every drop of rain on her skin, every beat of her heart, every tremor of fear. She looked at the Apache, at the calm in his eyes, and wondered how he could stand so steady when the storm was about to break all around them. The hunters shouted again, demanding surrender. The warriors answered with words she could not understand, their tones sharp, defiant. The mist swirled like smoke between them, hiding nothing but revealing everything. The Apache raised his voice, speaking to both sides, his words strong and unwavering. She could not understand the language, but she felt the power of it, the command in his tone, the promise in his stance. Still, the rifles did not lower. The bows did not slacken. The valley itself seemed to tremble, waiting for the spark that would unleash the fire. The woman's breath caught. She knew that in the next moment, lives would be lost. The conflict that had begun in the saloon was no longer just hers. To bear it had grown into something much greater, something that could not be undone. The hunter's pride, the warrior's defense, the Apache's defiance, all of it now collided in the misty dawn. And as thunder rolled one last time across the prairie, the standoff reached its breaking point. The moment of decision had come, and nothing could stop the storm that was about to fall. The morning air trembled as both sides faced each other in the valley, weapons raised, hearts pounding. The woman stood behind the Apache, clutching her skirt in trembling hands, unable to breathe. The hunters on the ridge shouted, their rifles trained downward, while the warriors below held their bows steady, arrows ready to fly. She felt trapped in the space between two storms, and for one long, unbearable moment, she believed she would never see another sunrise. Then the Apache stepped forward. His voice carried across the valley, calm yet commanding. His words spoken in a language she did not understand but felt in her bones. His arms spread wide, not in surrender, but in defiance of the hatred on both sides. He spoke with the authority of someone who knew the land, someone who had lived between danger and survival his whole life. His voice rose above the shouts, above the rumble of thunder fading in the distance, and for a moment, the weapons wavered. The woman watched as his people listened, their eyes fixed on him, their bows still drawn, but their expressions shifting. He was not just another man fleeing a town's anger. He was one of them, a warrior, and his words carried weight. Slowly, one by one, the bows lowered, though the warriors kept their stance firm. From the ridge, the hunters cursed, furious at what they saw as betrayal. Their fingers tight on the triggers of their rifles, the silence broke when one of the hunters fired. The shot cracked through the valley, and the woman screamed as the bullet struck the rocks near her feet. Dust flew, and chaos erupted. Arrows flew from the warriors below, striking the ridge in sharp bursts, while the hunters fired back in blind rage. The Apache seized her hand, pulling her to cover behind a boulder. Shielding her as the valley exploded with violence, she pressed against the rock, her breath ragged, the sound of arrows and gunfire filling her ears. For the first time, she realized how fragile life was in this land, how quickly pride and vengeance could tear it apart. Yet even as fear consumed her, she felt the Apache's hand steady on hers, his presence unshaken. When the gunfire began to fade, the hunters cursed and retreated, realizing the valley was not theirs to claim. One by one, they turned their horses and vanished back into the mist, their threats echoing behind them. "This isn't over," one shouted, his voice carrying the weight of promise. Then the valley fell silent, except for the ragged sound of breathing and the whisper of the wind through the grass. The woman turned to the Apache, her heart still racing. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since the saloon, she allowed herself to believe they might live through this. The warriors approached, their expressions hard, their bows lowered now, but their eyes filled with questions. They spoke to him, their voices sharp but not unkind, and he answered with the same calm steadiness he had shown all night. She could not understand the words, but she saw the way their eyes shifted from him to her, their gazes weighing her like a stone on a scale. She held her breath, afraid of what they might decide. Finally, the oldest among them nodded, and the warriors stepped back, clearing the path. It was not an embrace, but it was not rejection either. It was acceptance enough. The Apache led her deeper into the valley, where the campfires glowed faintly, and women and children peered from the shadows. She felt their eyes on her, curiosity mixed with caution. She was a stranger here, an outsider in every way, yet no one turned her away. For the first time in days, she felt a sliver of safety, though uncertainty still clung to her heart. That night by the fire, the Apache finally spoke of his past. He told her of the raids against his people, of the broken promises, the lives lost when settlers claimed more land and pushed his tribe into smaller corners of the world. He had fought to protect what remained, but the cost had been high. He had known betrayal, hunger, and grief. Yet through it all, he had never lost his resolve to stand for those who could not stand for themselves. She listened, her heart heavy, realizing how small her own struggles seemed compared to the weight he carried. And yet he had chosen to save her. He had walked into that saloon not for glory, not for pride, but because he could not bear to see another person crushed beneath cruelty in return. She shared her story of the farm she had lost, of the family taken by sickness, of the loneliness that had driven her west, only to find herself trapped again in a different kind of cage. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but he listened, his eyes never leaving hers. And she felt for the first time that her pain was not invisible. Days passed, and the camp became a strange kind of refuge. She learned to fetch water from the stream, to help prepare food, to listen to the songs sung at night that carried both sorrow and strength. Yet even as life in the valley grew familiar, the shadow of danger never left. The hunters had returned to town, but their pride had been wounded, and she knew they would not forget. Nor would the settlers let the presence of an outsider woman among the Apache go unanswered. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the prairie in gold, she asked him what would happen when the hunters came again. He was quiet for a long time before answering, "Then we will face them. Together." His words carried no false comfort, only truth. And in that truth, she found courage. The final confrontation came sooner than she had hoped. Riders appeared at the edge of the valley one morning, rifles glinting in the light, their voices carrying across the grass. They demanded her return, spat curses at the Apache, and swore the valley would burn if they did not obey. The woman stepped forward then, surprising even herself. Her voice shook, but it carried across the distance. She told them she was not theirs to take, that she had been saved from their cruelty, and that she would not return to the saloon. Her words struck the air like arrows, defiant and clear. The hunters shouted in rage, but she did not waver. The Apache stood beside her. His people gathered behind him, and for the first time the hunters hesitated. They saw not a lone warrior and a frightened woman, but a united front, a wall of strength that would not bow to their will. They cursed, threatened, and finally rode away, their fury unresolved but their power broken. The valley fell quiet again, and the woman felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The danger was not gone forever, but the moment had passed, and for now she was free. She turned to the Apache, her eyes wet with tears she had held too long. "I thought I would never belong anywhere," she whispered, "but here, with you." He looked at her, his expression calm but softened by something unspoken. "You are no longer alone," he said simply. as the sun rose higher. Casting light across the endless prairie, she felt the truth of his words settle in her heart. She had faced danger in the saloon. She had been hunted across the hills, but through it all, she had found something she never expected: strength, belonging. In a bond forged in fire, the land would always be harsh. The conflicts between settlers and tribes would not vanish overnight. But she knew now that life was more than fear. It was about standing, about defying the chains others tried to place on you, about finding the courage to walk forward even when the path was uncertain. And so, with the Apache at her side, she stepped into the future, not knowing what storms might come, but certain that she would face them with the same defiance that had carried her out of the saloon and into a life worth fighting for. The prairie wind carried their shadows long against the earth, two figures bound not by blood but by choice, moving forward together into a world that had once only offered her despair. And though danger still lingered at the edges, she no longer feared it, for she had been carried out of darkness, and she had found the strength to never return.